Before starting the story, subscribe our channel for more Revange stories. Let's begin the story. The glass in the boardroom of Vance Logistical Solutions wasn't just glass, it was a statement. It was floor-to-ceiling, triple-paned, and tinted with a subtle polarized hue that made the sprawling, smoggy outskirts of Columbus look like a high-definition photograph of progress. Arthur Vance sat at the head of the table, his hands folded. They were hands that had spent the 1980s hauling crates, hands that had calluses under the skin like deep-rooted stones, though now they were scrubbed clean and rested on a surface of polished mahogany. Across from him sat his daughter, Sarah. She was wearing a suit that cost more than Arthur's first 3 delivery trucks combined. Beside her sat Julian, her husband, a man whose smile always reminded Arthur of a predatory bird, sharp, light, and hovering. "It's about the optics, Dad," Sarah said. Her voice was practiced. It had that flat, Silicon Valley cadence she'd picked up during her years away, a tone that treated human emotion like an inefficient line of code. "We're 48 hours from the IPO. The investors aren't just buying our software, they're buying a vision of the future, and a founder's father sitting in the chief operating officer chair. It feels like a family business. We need it to feel like a global entity." Arthur looked at the stack of papers in front of him. They were transition agreements. That was the phrase Julian had used. It sounded like a bridge. In reality, Arthur knew it was an anchor. "I put the seed money into this, Sarah. When the VCS were ready to gut you 3 years ago because the burn rate was too high, I sold the lake property. I didn't ask for optics. I asked for a seat so I could make sure the trucks actually showed up on time. And you did a great job, Arthur," Julian chimed in, his voice oily. "Truly, your old-school grit got us through the mud, but we're on the highway now. We've automated the routing, we've streamlined the vendor portals. The grit phase is over. We need you to take the win. Go to Florida, play golf, be the founder emeritus. It's a title of honor." Arthur didn't look at Julian. He kept his eyes on his daughter. He was looking for the girl who used to ride shotgun in his rig, eating sunflower seeds and asking how the air brakes worked. But that girl was buried under layers of ambition and Julian's whispers. He realized then that they weren't just asking him to retire. They were trying to erase the thumbprint of the man who had built the floor they were standing on. They viewed him as a relic, a biological glitch in their seamless digital world. "The papers," Arthur said quietly, "say that I relinquish all voting rights and oversight authority effective immediately upon the opening bell of the IPO. In exchange, I get a lump sum and a consultant contract." "Exactly," Sarah said, leaning forward, sensing his supposed surrender. "You'll still be a consultant. We'll call you if we need the human touch." Arthur picked up a heavy silver pen. He felt the weight of it. He saw Julian's eyes track the movement like a hawk watching a mouse. They thought he was old. They thought that because he struggled with the new CRM interface, he didn't understand the flow of the world. They forgot that software was just a map and Arthur knew the actual roads. He signed the first page, then the second. He saw Sarah exhale, a physical release of tension. Julian actually smirked. "I'll need 48 hours to clear out the personal files from my office," Arthur said. "Since I'm just a consultant now, I wouldn't want to be in the way of the optics tomorrow." "Of course," Sarah said, standing up to kiss his cheek. She smelled like expensive perfume and victory. "We're doing this for you, Dad. So you can finally relax." Arthur didn't go home. He went to his office, but he didn't pack his photos or his brass paperweights. Instead, he sat at his desk and opened the one system Sarah and Julian had neglected to modernize because they found it too boring to bother with. The raw ledger of the third-party logistics, 3PL contracts. For the last 6 months, Arthur had noticed a ghost in the machine. While Sarah was busy presenting sleek PowerPoints to investors about AI-driven efficiency, Arthur had been watching the physical manifests. He knew how much diesel it took to get 10 tons from Chicago to Atlanta. He knew the cost of pallet storage in the Jersey ports, and the numbers in the system weren't matching the reality of the road. He pulled up a vendor named Aegis Distribution. It was a new addition, brought on by Julian 6 months ago. On paper, they handled the overflow of the Northeast Corridor. But Arthur, using his outdated methods, had called a few old friends at the Port Authority. No one had seen an Aegis truck in 3 weeks, yet, according to the ledger, Vance Logistical was paying them $400,000 a month for priority lane maintenance. He began to print. Not to the office printer, which was networked and monitored, but to the old standalone inkjet he kept in the corner for his personal tax records. The machine chattered and groaned, spitting out pages of evidence. Julian wasn't just moving the company toward an IPO, he was hollowing it out. He was skimming the burn rate cash into a shell company, likely planning to vanish or settle in a non-extradition country once the IPO money hit and the inevitable audit revealed the shortfall a year later. Sarah likely didn't know, or worse, she didn't want to know as long as the valuation kept climbing. Arthur looked at the clock. The IPO was in 36 hours. The consultant clause in his new contract, the one Julian had written to be ceremonial, contained a specific, overlooked legal loophole. In their haste to strip him of operational power, they had classified his remaining shares under a legacy stake provision to avoid certain tax liabilities. But in the state of Ohio, a legacy stakeholder in a transportation firm held a mandatory safety and integrity veto if they could prove the company's physical assets were being misrepresented to the state. He wasn't going to Florida, he was going to work. The day of the IPO arrived with the kind of fanfare usually reserved for a royal wedding. The lobby of the exchange was filled with champagne, blue and white balloons, and monitors flashing the ticker symbol. Vance, Sarah was at the center of a circle of reporters, talking about the democratization of the supply chain. Julian stood just behind her, his hand on her waist, looking like the cat that had not only caught the canary but had insured it for millions. Arthur arrived late. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing his old work jacket over a clean shirt. He didn't go to the champagne toast. He went straight to the boardroom where the lead underwriters from the bank were finalizing the digital go command. Arthur, Julian said, stepping away from the crowd, his face darkening as he saw his father-in-law. What are you doing here? This isn't the place for whatever this is. You're supposed to be at the hotel. I was reading my new contract, Julian, Arthur said, loud enough for a few nearby investors to turn their heads. The consultant part. I wanted to make sure I understood my duties. We'll discuss it Monday, Julian hissed, grabbing Arthur's arm. Get out of here before you embarrass Sarah. Arthur didn't flinch. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, the manifest for Aegis distribution. I found a glitch in the software, Julian, a big one. It seems we're paying for trucks that don't exist. Now, as a legacy stakeholder with safety and integrity oversight, I have a fiduciary duty to report this to the underwriters before the bell rings. Otherwise, it's not an IPO, it's securities fraud. The color drained from Julian's face so fast it was almost poetic. You don't know what you're talking about. That's a private accounting matter. It was, Arthur said, stepping past him toward the lead underwriter, until you gave me the title of consultant. You wanted me to have a title of honor, didn't you? Well, I've decided to be very honorable today. Sarah approached, her brow furrowed. Dad, what's going on? Arthur looked at his daughter. This was the moment of the correction. He didn't feel joy, only a grim sort of necessity. Sarah, your husband has been stealing from the house I built, and because you were so eager to get me out of the way, you didn't check the lock on the back door. I'm stopping the IPO. You can't, she whispered, horrified. The valuation, the investors. The valuation is a lie, Arthur said firmly. He turned to the bank representative. My name is Arthur Vance. I am the legacy stakeholder of this firm. I am invoking Section 4B of the transition agreement. We have a material misrepresentation of assets. Do not ring that bell. The room went silent. The ticker on the screen continued to scroll, but the VNCE symbol stayed gray. The optics had just shattered. The fallout was instantaneous. In the small, windowless, cool-down room of the exchange, the roles had flipped. Sarah sat in a chair, her head in her hands, while Julian paced like a caged animal, shouting into his phone until Arthur's lawyer, the same plain-as-gravel man from the old days, ordered him to sit down. The IPO is postponed indefinitely, Arthur said, leaning against the door. The SEC is going to want to talk about Aegis distribution, and since I'm still a consultant, I've already turned over the logs from the standalone printer in my office. You ruined us, Julian spat. You destroyed Sarah's dream because your ego couldn't handle a smaller office. No, Arthur said. I saved the company from a prison sentence, and I saved my daughter from being a co-conspirator to a man who would sell her out the moment the check cleared. He looked at Sarah. She finally looked up, her eyes red. The visionary was gone, replaced by someone who realized she'd been building a castle on a swamp. I'm taking back the voting shares, Sarah, Arthur said quietly. Not because I want to run the company forever, but because you aren't ready. You forgot that the trucks are real, the drivers are real, the theft was real. You signed the reversal papers today, and I'll keep the investigators focused on Julian's shell companies and away from your personal accounts. You get to keep your reputation, but you lose the chair. He slid a new stack of papers across the table. They weren't elegant, they weren't polished, they were printed on standard white paper. Sign here, Arthur said, echoing the words she had used on him 48 hours earlier. It's simple. Mr. Haynes already explained everything. Sarah looked at the pen. She looked at Julian, who was currently trying to delete files on his phone, then at her father. For the first time in years, she saw him not as a relic, but as the man who knew where the foundations were buried. She picked up the pen. Arthur watched her sign. He felt the weight of the building settle back onto his shoulders. It was heavy, but it was his. He wasn't going to Florida. He was going back to the warehouse. There were manifests to check. There were real people to pay. And for the first time since he'd buried his wife, Arthur Vance felt like he could finally breathe. The silence that followed the freezing of the IPO was not the peaceful kind. It was the pressurized silence of a deep-sea hull beginning to buckle. The champagne in the lobby was getting warm. The investors, men who measured their lives in fractional pips and millisecond trades, were beginning to vibrate with a predatory sort of confusion. Arthur stood at the window of the cool-down room, watching the red digital numbers of the stock ticker move past. He felt remarkably calm. It was the calm of a man who had finally put a stray dog out of the house. Julian was still in the corner, his thumb blurring over his phone screen. He was sweating, a frantic, greasy sheen that made his expensive haircut look ridiculous. "We can fix this," Julian whispered, though he wasn't talking to Arthur or Sarah. He was talking to the void. "We just need to reclassify the Aegis payments as advance infrastructure credits. It's an accounting pivot." "Sarah, tell your father he's misinterpreting the tax strategy." Sarah didn't move. She was staring at the reversal of authority document Arthur had placed in front of her. Her world had been a series of sleek glass surfaces and upward trending lines for so long that the sudden introduction of gravity seemed to have paralyzed her. "The strategy," Arthur said, his voice cutting through Julian's frantic muttering, "was to steal. Let's not use four-syllable words to dress up a two-bit crime, Julian. You saw a lot of cash moving through the burn rate phase and you thought no one was counting the pallets. You thought I was too busy squinting at the computer screen to notice the weight of the trucks. You don't understand the scale of this," Julian shouted, suddenly standing. He stepped toward Arthur, his finger stabbing the air. "Vance Logistical is a billion-dollar entity on paper. Aegis was a drop in the bucket, a rounding error. You've killed a billion-dollar launch over $4 million. Do you know what the shareholders will do to you? They'll sue you into the dirt." "I am the shareholder," Arthur reminded him. The majority won, as of 10 minutes ago when Sarah's silence became a legal forfeiture of her tie-breaking vote. "And as for being sued into the dirt, Julian, I started in the dirt. I know the texture of it. You're the one who's afraid of getting your suit stained." Arthur turned to Sarah. "I'm going back to the office. Not the one on the 40th floor with the espresso machine. I'm going to the distribution hub in O'Hare. I'm going to sit with the night shift dispatchers, and I'm going to find out exactly how deep this rot goes. You can stay here with the lawyers, or you can come with me and start learning how to actually run a business instead of just performing as a CEO." Sarah looked up. The hollow expression in her eyes was starting to sharpen into something else. Not quite forgiveness, but a flickering of the old pragmatism Arthur had taught her when she was 12. "The underwriters," she said, her voice raspy. "They'll want blood, Dad. They put 10 million into the pre-float. They won't just walk away." "They'll get their money," Arthur said, "but they'll get it from a company that actually exists, not a hollowed-out shell. Now let's go. This building is starting to smell like a funeral." The Vance Logistical Distribution Hub was a cathedral of corrugated steel and diesel fumes. It was 3 a.m. when Arthur's car pulled up to the gate. Sarah was in the passenger seat, having left Julian at the exchange with a battery of lawyers. She hadn't spoken for the entire 2-hour drive. The gate guard, a man named Miller who had worked for Arthur since the early 90s, leaned out of his booth. He saw Arthur and his eyes widened. "Artie, what are you doing here? I heard you were in New York for the big payday." "The payday got rained out, Miller," Arthur said, tipping his cap. "How's the gate log looking for the northeast corridor?" Miller frowned. "Funny you ask. We've had 6 Aegis manifests come through the digital system tonight, but not a single one of their rigs has hit the scale. I flagged it for the night supervisor, but he said to just ghost verify them, said it was a directive from the top." Arthur glanced at Sarah. She flinched as if she'd been struck. "Who's the night supervisor?" Arthur asked. "New guy. Hired 3 months ago, name's Vance. Well, he's a cousin of Julian's, I think." Arthur didn't wait for the gate to fully retract. He drove through, the tires of his sedan kicking up the gravel of a yard that felt more like home than any boardroom. He parked near the loading docks, where the rhythmic hiss of air brakes and the beep of forklifts created a symphony of industry. Inside the supervisor's office, a young man in a pristine Vance Logistical polo shirt was leaning back in a swivel chair, his feet on the desk. He was looking at a tablet, a smirk on his face. He didn't see Arthur and Sarah enter until Arthur slammed a heavy metal clipboard onto the desk. "Office is closed to drivers," the young man said without looking up. "Check the portal." "I'm not a driver," Arthur said, "and you're not a supervisor anymore. You're a witness." The young man looked up, his smirk vanishing as he recognized Sarah from the company newsletters. "Miss Vance, I didn't." "Julian said you guys were in New York." "Julian said a lot of things," Sarah said, stepping forward. For the first time, she wasn't the polished executive. She was Arthur Vance's daughter. She grabbed the tablet from his hands. "Show me the Aegis authentication codes. Now." I don't have them. They're encrypted," the boy stammered. Arthur walked around the desk. He didn't use force. He just used the presence of a man who had built the very walls the boy was hiding within. "Son, I know every inch of this server. I know the backdoors Julian had his IT consultants build. I also know that ghost verifying manifests is a federal offense when those manifests involve interstate commerce and insurance bonding. You can talk to me or you can talk to the Department of Transportation investigators who are going to be here at dawn. The boy broke in less than 5 minutes. He hadn't even been paid that much, just a promise of a management track position once the IPO went through and the old guard was cleared out. He showed them the software patch Julian had installed. It was a simple mirror script. For every 10 real trucks that left the yard, the script generated one fake Aegis truck, complete with a forged weight scale certificate and a simulated GPS route. The money for these ghost trips was routed to a payroll account in a different state. Sarah watched the screen, her face turning a ghostly pale. He was stealing from the driver's bonus pool to fund the shell company, she whispered. He wasn't just stealing from the investors, he was stealing from the men on the floor. That's the thing about men like Julian, Arthur said, pulling up a chair. They think the floor is just a foundation for their shoes. They don't realize that if you steal enough of the floor, the whole ceiling comes down on your head. By 5 a.m, the office was filled with the smell of stale coffee and the hum of a high-speed scanner. Arthur had called in his old inner circle, men and women who had been transitioned into early retirement or sidelined into advisory roles when Julian took over. They arrived one by one, some in flannel shirts, some in old work jackets, all of them carrying a lifetime of institutional knowledge. They didn't ask questions. They saw Arthur at the head of the table and they went to work. They were the old guard, the people Julian had mocked as technologically illiterate, but they knew how to read a bill of lading like a priest reads scripture. "Artie, look at this," said Brenda, who had been the head of billing for 20 years before Julian replaced her with an algorithm. She pointed to a series of fuel tax credits. "He's been double dipping. He's claiming credits for the ghost trucks and then rebating them back into a private LLC registered to his mother's maiden name." "How much?" Arthur asked. "Total across all departments, we're looking at close to 12 million over the last 18 months, Brenda said, her voice shaking with anger. "He was bleeding us dry while telling us we were having a record year." Sarah was sitting at a side desk, sorting through the culture and branding files Julian had been in charge of. She stopped at a folder labeled Founder Transition. Inside were plans for a series of press releases to be issued after the IPO. They didn't just announce Arthur's retirement. They painted him as a man struggling with cognitive decline, a move designed to insulate the company if he ever tried to speak out about Julian's management. She brought the folder to Arthur. She didn't say a word. She just laid it open in front of him. Arthur read the draft of the press release. After a courageous battle with the early stages of memory loss, Arthur Vance has decided to step away from the firm he loves. The words hit Arthur harder than the financial theft ever could. Julian hadn't just tried to take his money, he had tried to take his dignity. He had planned to tell the world that the man who had built Vance Logistical from a single truck was a confused old man who didn't know where he was. Arthur looked at Sarah. She was crying now, silent tears of shame. "I didn't know, Dad, I swear to you. I thought he was just being protective. He told me you were getting overwhelmed. He told me you were forgetting things in the board meetings." "And you believed him," Arthur said. "It wasn't a question. I wanted the IPO," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I wanted to prove I could take what you built and make it world-class. I was so focused on the horizon that I didn't look at who was steering the ship." Arthur stood up and walked over to her. He put a calloused hand on her shoulder. "The horizon is a fine thing to look at, Sarah, but a captain who doesn't know what's in the bilge isn't a captain. They're just a passenger." He looked around the room at his old friends, the people Julian had discarded. "All right, everyone. We have 4 hours until the banks open. We're not just going to report a crime, we're going to perform a surgical extraction." The extraction was a masterclass in old-school leverage. Arthur didn't call the police first. He called the lead underwriter at the bank, a man named Marcus Thorne, who had a reputation for being as cold as a January morning in Duluth. "Marcus," Arthur said when the man picked up his private line, "I have 12 million reasons why your bank is about to be the lead defendant in a class action lawsuit for IPO fraud. Unless, of course, you'd like to help me fix it before the news hits the wire." Within the hour, Marcus Thorne was on a private jet, and by 9 a.m. he was sitting in the warehouse office, staring at Brenda's ledgers. He was a man of numbers, and the numbers were screaming. "Julian is a dead man walking," Thorne said, rubbing his temples. "But the company, Artie, if this goes public like this, the Vance name is toxic. You'll be in litigation for a decade. That's why we're going to do a management buyback before the SEC gets the formal filing," Arthur said. "Julian signs over every share, every cent of his separation package, and confesses to the specific embezzlement of the Aegis funds. In exchange, we don't name the bank in the fraud filing. You get to say you detected the irregularity and worked with the founder to rectify it. You come out looking like a hero of corporate governance. And Julian, Thorne asked. Julian gets to choose between a quiet exit with no money and a very loud entrance into a federal penitentiary, Arthur said. And what about Sarah? Arthur looked at his daughter, who was standing by the loading docks watching the morning sun hit the trucks. Sarah is going to spend the next year in the passenger seat of a long-haul rig. She's going to learn the business from the asphalt up. If she survives the winter, we'll talk about her coming back to the office. The final confrontation took place in the penthouse apartment Julian and Sarah shared. It was a place of white marble and minimalist furniture, a place that felt like it had no history. Julian was there, surrounded by luggage, his passport on the kitchen island. He was planning his exit. He didn't hear Arthur enter. The consultant still had the key codes. Going somewhere, Julian? Arthur asked. Julian spun around, his face a mask of terror that quickly tried to settle into its usual arrogance. Arthur, I was coming to find you. We can still salvage the New York deal. I've talked to some contacts in London. Stop, Arthur said. He tossed a thick blue folder onto the marble island. That's the confession, and that's the share transfer agreement. You have 10 minutes to sign them both. You have nothing, Julian bluffed, though his hands were shaking. A few ghost trucks, a clerical error. My lawyers will tie you up for years. Your lawyers just quit, Arthur said. Marcus Thorne told them that if they represented you, the bank would blackball their firm for life. You're alone in this room, Julian, just like you thought I was. Julian looked at the papers. He looked at the window as if considering the jump. Finally, the arrogance broke. He collapsed into a chair, the predatory bird finally grounded. I just wanted what you had, he whispered. The power, the respect. Everyone looks at you like you're some kind of king. I'm just the son-in-law. I was never a king, Arthur said. I was a driver, that's what you never understood. People don't respect me because of the money. They respect me because I know how to do the work. You tried to buy the respect with stolen money. It doesn't work that way. Julian signed. He signed away the millions, the shares, the house, and his future. When he was done, he looked up at Arthur. What now? Now, Arthur said, you leave. And if I ever see you near my daughter or my company again, I'll stop being a consultant and start being the man who used to break tie rods with his bare hands. Do you understand? Julian didn't say a word. He grabbed his passport and ran. A year later, the O'Hare hub was quiet. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. Arthur was sitting on the bumper of his old truck, the one he'd kept in the back of the barn for years. It was polished now, the engine humming with a perfect, rhythmic thrum. A dusty Vance logistical rig pulled into the yard. The driver hopped out, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had just finished a 14-hour run. She was wearing work boots, jeans, and a high-vis vest. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her face was streaked with the grime of the road. She walked over to Arthur and handed him a logbook. Chicago to Denver and back, Sarah said. 3 tons of medical supplies, 2 tons of electronics, no delays. Fuel efficiency was up 4% because I took the alternate route through the pass. Arthur checked the book. He checked the stamps. He looked at his daughter, not the visionary in the expensive suit, but the woman who knew the weight of her load. Good work, Sarah, he said. The night shift is short a dispatcher. You want the desk? Sarah smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached her eyes. I think I'll take the floor, Dad. I heard there's a glitch in the warehouse inventory system. I want to find it myself. Arthur watched her walk toward the warehouse. He picked up his silver pen and put it in his pocket. He wasn't a founder emeritus. He wasn't a consultant. He was just a man who had built a floor that could finally, truly, hold the weight of the future. The company wasn't billion-dollar on paper anymore. It was something better. It was real. And Arthur Vance, at 65 years old, had never felt more alive. The air in the O'Hare hub felt different after the ghost audit. It was thicker with a sense of cautious relief, but the scars Julian had left were deep. Arthur didn't move back into the 40th floor office. Instead, he stayed in the cage, a glass-walled enclosure in the center of the sorting floor. He wanted the drivers to see him. He wanted to hear the forklifts. He was 65, but he felt like he had been rebooted. The cognitive decline Julian had tried to manufacture was revealed to be a sharp, focused brilliance that only comes from knowing every bolt and bearing of a machine. But the war wasn't over. Julian had disappeared, but his legal team, a group of high-priced sharks who specialized in reputational preservation, were still filing motions in the background. They were trying to argue that the share transfer Arthur had forced in the penthouse was done under duress. They were trying to claim that Arthur had kidnapped the company's future. Arthur spent his nights reading the fine print. He wasn't looking at the law anymore. He was looking at the history of the industry. He remembered a cold October in 1994 when he had nearly gone bankrupt because a fuel supplier had spiked the prices. He remembered the specific language of the emergency continuity laws passed after the 2008 crash. He was looking for a ghost of his own, a way to make sure Julian could never even look at a truck again without trembling. Sarah was still on the road. Her letters, actual handwritten letters sent from truck stops in Nebraska and Nevada, were changing. They no longer talked about synergy or market share. They talked about the way the light hits the salt flats at dawn. They talked about the smell of a diner at 2 a.m. She was becoming human again, stripped of the digital vanity that had nearly blinded her. Arthur kept those letters in a locked drawer. They were his real treasure. The final blow began with a phone call from an old contact at the port of Long Beach. "Artie," the voice crackled over the line, "you might want to check the manifest on a private freighter called the Silver Streak. It's registered to a holding company out of the Caymans, but the signature on the docking fee looks a lot like your former son-in-law's." Arthur felt the familiar hum of the chase. Julian hadn't just run. He had tried to take a parting gift. Arthur pulled the digital logs. He discovered that Julian had authorized a final, massive shipment of high-end specialized medical equipment. Prototypes from a subsidiary Vance Logistical had acquired a year prior to be moved for storage. In reality, Julian was trying to sell the intellectual property to a competitor in East Asia. It was a heist disguised as a shipment, and because the IPO had been frozen, Julian still had residual signing authority on that specific subsidiary until the final court order was processed. He was trying to liquidate the company's most valuable secret before he vanished for good. Arthur didn't call the police. He called Miller at the gate. "Miller, get the heavy-duty rig ready, the one with the long-haul sleeper. And tell Sarah to meet me at the hub. It's time for her final exam." The drive from Chicago to Long Beach is 2,000 miles of concrete and determination. Arthur and Sarah took turns at the wheel. It was a silent, grueling marathon. They didn't talk about the past. They talked about the road. Sarah drove the graveyard shift, her eyes fixed on the white lines, her hands steady. She was no longer the girl in the suit. She was a Vance. They reached the docks just as the Silver Streak was preparing to cast off. Julian was there, standing on the deck, looking like a man who had finally escaped. He saw the Vance logistical rig pull up to the pier, but he didn't look worried. He had the papers. He had the legal right to move that cargo. Arthur climbed out of the cab. He looked tired, his face lined with the dust of 4 states, but his eyes were like flint. "You're too late, Arthur," Julian shouted over the railing. "The paperwork is filed. The sale is final. This isn't a ghost truck. This is my retirement." Arthur walked to the edge of the pier. He held up a small, weathered leather book, his original 1978 master carrier's license and the foundational charter of the company. "I didn't come to stop the ship, Julian," Arthur said. "I came to tell you that I found the Aegis servers, all of them. The ones you thought you wiped. It turns out, when you use company Wi-Fi to move stolen money, the logs are archived in a physical backup in the basement of the O'Hare hub. A backup you forgot about because you thought physical things were outdated." Julian's smile faltered. "And since you're currently on a vessel in international waters with stolen intellectual property," Arthur continued, "the Coast Guard is already 3 miles out. But here's the consultant's advice. If you jump now and swim to the pier, I'll tell the feds you cooperated. If you stay on that boat, you're going to be a man without a country, because I just bought the holding company that owns the Silver Streak. You're standing on my deck, Julian, and I'm ordering you off my ship." The arrest was quiet. There were no cameras, no optics. Julian was led away in handcuffs, his expensive loafers clicking hollowly on the wet wood of the pier. He didn't look at Arthur, he didn't look at Sarah, he looked at the ground. Sarah stood beside her father, watching the ship's lights flicker in the harbor. "Is it over?" she asked. "The stealing is over," Arthur said. "The building. That never ends." They drove back across the country, but they didn't rush. They stopped in small towns. They talked to independent operators. Arthur realized that he didn't want to be the king of a billion-dollar empire. He wanted to be the steward of a legacy. When they finally returned to Chicago, Arthur called a meeting of the entire company, every driver, every warehouse worker, every clerk. He didn't stand on a stage. He stood on a wooden pallet in the middle of the loading bay. "We're not going public," Arthur announced. The room went silent. "We're going private, but not for me. We're forming an ESOP, an employee stock ownership plan. Every mile you drive, every crate you move, you're earning a piece of this floor, because a company isn't its valuation. It's the people who keep the wheels turning." The roar that went up from the floor was louder than any engine Arthur had ever heard. 5 years later, Arthur Vance sat on his porch in the Ohio countryside. The lake property he had once sold to save the company was back in his name. He'd bought it back with the first year's honest profits. He was holding a glass of iced tea, watching the fireflies. A car pulled up the drive. It was Sarah. She was the president now, but she still wore her work boots. She sat down next to him, and they sat in the kind of silence that only comes from years of shared labor. "We hit the targets, Dad," she said. The housing fund in Mom's name just opened its 10th unit for retired drivers, and the Aegis litigation is finally closed. Julian's out in 2 years, but he's barred from the industry for life. Arthur nodded. He looked at his hands, still calloused, still strong. He thought about that day in the boardroom, the day they tried to treat him like a ghost. You know, Sarah, Arthur said, a bit of a wit-sharpened glint in his eye, Julian was right about one thing. I was a relic. But he forgot that relics are the only things that survive the storm. Everything else just gets blown away. Sarah laughed and leaned her head on his shoulder. The optics were perfect. Not for a magazine, not for a reporter, but for a family that had finally learned that the most important contract isn't the one you sign with a lawyer, it's the one you keep with the people you love. Arthur Vance closed his eyes. The world was quiet, the trucks were moving, and for the first time in his life he didn't need to check the manifest. He knew exactly where he was. He was home. The end. Before going, subscribe our channel for more stories. Goodbye till the next story.